So 8 exists and Santa exists. Because 8 and Santa do not exist, well, what kinds of commitments do they incur? Well, they incur the same kinds of commitments on this resilient strategy because they're just referring to gappy contents. So one might then, once again, go Phrygian, which is the hidden indexical theory is sort of a Phrygian move because they would invoke, or could be a Phrygian move anyway, because they would invoke, again, a reference, a sort of implicit reference in belief reports to something like propositional guises or senses. The important thing is that that leads to the hyperintentionality of ontological commitments. Once you have belief is a hyperintentional operator, and once you have belief involved in an analysis of ontological commitment, it's natural to expect that you would get hyperintentionality. But you can also get the argument off the ground without talking about beliefs. So let's just define hyperintentionality. So if you have an operator O, and you have two sentences, and they're necessarily equivalent, and so you plug in O in front of each of the sentences, and the result of doing that will not be necessarily equivalent. That's what it is to be hyperintentional for an operator. So we can extend that to ontological commitment. If we extend that to ontological commitment, we might say something like this. Well, whenever you have two expressions and they're necessarily coextensional, and still you can't substitute one for the other in a sentence that talks about ontological commitments. If that's the case, then ontological commitment would be a hyperintentional relation. So naturally, of course, it will be a hyperintentional relation because here's an example. So 8 and 9 are necessarily coextensional, but 8 exists, commits us to 8. It does not commit us to 9. Again, this is on the assumption that there are no numbers. Just by that simple example, we would actually get ontological commitment to be hyperintentional. And we could pick other examples. If you don't like these ones, you could talk about pink numbers exist. There are pink numbers and there are orange numbers, which at least some people might think that they should have different commitments. Okay, so just a quick summary here. So it's the way we talk. We say that the ontological commitment relation is a relation between a sentence and a class of things, or a sentence and an object. And what I'm suggesting is, well, that's not quite right. It should be a relation between an intentional act or speech act and a hyperintention, which is something like an error concept or a sense. Okay, so how wide-ranging is this hyperintentionality of the ontological commitment relation? So Hesperus exists. Well, that commits us to the existence of Hesperus. It requires us to believe that Hesperus exists. The question then arises, what about phosphorus? Well, Hesperus exists. Should that commit us to also to phosphorus exists? Should be, the second line should be Hesperus exists. We might imagine a theory, actually two theories in ancient Greece. So we would have one theory talking about Hesperus and its properties as an evening star, and we would have another theory talking about phosphorus as the morning star instantiating certain properties. And we might want those two theories to have different ontological commitments, in which case the hyperintentionality of the operator would be quite wide-ranging. Ultimately, if this explication that we just talked about is correct, it will come down to whether we should accept a certain closure principle for rational what you're rationally required to believe. So are you rationally required to believe all consequences of what you are rationally required to believe? We saw yesterday that Mark Cullivan suggested that maybe we are actually committed to that, but we should give up classical logic. And I was trying to push for that, well, maybe we shouldn't accept this strong closure principle. I'm not going to take a stance on this, but I'm just going to say that if we deny the closure principle, then these terms won't necessarily be intersubstitutable. So ontological commitment will be relative, agent relative, because it will depend on or perhaps society relative, would depend on what people actually, the sort of overall doxastic state of the person, the agent. We might also take another line. If we think this is too radical, we could take another line and say, well, actually, yes, the closure principle holds, in which case ontological commitment could still be agent neutral. Okay, I'm actually close to being done. Okay, so some consequences of it. It turned out, like by coincidence, actually, there's actually some close connection between Mark's talk yesterday and this talk. So I actually cut out one slide, which was hopelessly naive compared to Mark's elaborate coverage of this. But I had a slide on inconsistent sentences. I cut that out, but there's some other interesting consequences, since we've already seen Mark's line on this. So normally when you invoke substitutional quantification, you're trying to avoid ontological commitments, because ontological commitment is supposed to be a substantial notion. So you can say, well, if you have a truth in the language, so as soon as example with Mickey Mouse is a fictional mouse that talks, you can infer from that, using substitutional quantifiers, that there are fictional mice that talk. And we don't get, normally, or at least that's what he's suggesting, we don't get ontological commitments from this. We're not committed to talking mice. Now, on the current approach, since this is not a substantial notion, if we go with this line of thinking about ontological commitment, well, what does it mean to say that we're committed to fictional mice, or that there are fictional mice that talk commits us to fictional mice? Well, it just means that accepting the sentence, really accepting, sincerely accepting the sentence, means that we ought to believe that there are fictional mice that talk. Or if you're just presupposing it, so suppose you're presupposing that there are fictional mice that talk, then you ought to believe it, but perhaps by the rules of presupposition that there are fictional mice that talk, or maybe you ought just to assent to it. But that means that, so standardly taken, well, Quine sort of seemed to think that the objectual quantification implies ontological commitments, substitutional quantification does not. We do not get that difference. So it's neutral. It does not, to say that a sentence is ontologically committed to something will not tell us anything about the quantifiers. It's a very sort of innocent way of speaking. The same will go for objectual quantification with a substitutional meta-language. This is again Jody Asuni's approach to objectual quantification, because he says, well, there's still the option when we have objectual quantification, we spell it out in terms of a domain, a range of the variables, but we use there is in the meta language. And so we could say, well, at the object language, we'll spell it out this way, objectually. But at the level of the meta language, we will spell it out in a non-objectual way, perhaps substitutional, perhaps some other related approach. And Jody Asuni says, oh, so we can avoid commitment that way. And again, on this very innocent way of construing ontological